Alhamdulillah wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa amma ba'du fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim Bismillahir rahmanir rahim faman ya'mal mithqala dharratin khayran yarah wa man ya'mal mithqala dharratin sharran yarah Sadaqallahul azim Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم اللهم صل على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم. Little things, little actions, little adjustments are often considered to be insignificant. This is both in the physical world and in the spiritual world. After all, the difference between a sneer and a smile, small change in facial expression, a face which is looking interesting, a face which is looking astonished, a face which is looking interested, shall I say, a face which is looking astonished, a face which is looking bewildered, a face full of grief, a face full of happiness, celebration, joy, jubilation, a face which is distracted, which implies a person being distracted, a face which is full of anger, frustration. Incidentally, in passing, let us mention that the Quran mentions this whole range of facial expressions. There's a long list here, and even the way the eyes are carried, looking up, looking down, looking sharply at someone, sharp tongues, their sharpness, the good word from the tongue, the word which shouldn't be spoken, the way a person turns their cheek up arrogantly, وَلَا تُصَعِّرْ خَدَّكَ لِلنَّاسِ, or the way a person lowers their voice. But the point here is these are small in one way, from one angle, one perspective. They're small changes from another that make all the difference. They are interpreted, they are a communication. In the mechanical world, it's the slight difference. If you under-tighten a nut on your car wheel, it could make all the difference. If there's a slight difference of pressure over or under in your tire, it can make all the difference. The couple of millimeters of tread can be the difference between life and death on a slippery road. Small changes, big implications. Small mistakes, big implications. If the key that you are fitting to open a lock has one notch short or one notch too much, if you've ever had a fresh key cut, you'll notice often a new freshly cut key is stiff because it hasn't worn to the exact shape. Only because the original key and the new key are similar doesn't mean that the new key will work. Sometimes you have to go back to the locksmith and you have to have the newly cut key filed to shape so that it snugly fits inside the lock. Small changes, big implications. This reminds me of an anecdote which has its own wisdom, of a factory in which the conveyor belt comes to a stop and the assembly line comes to a standstill, and people stand up straight and stretch their backs, and the work comes to a dead stop, and the manager of the factory becomes very concerned. The factory is losing large sums of money by the minute, and the engineer is called in after everything else fails, and he comes and takes a look around. He walks to a panel in the wall, he takes a fine screwdriver, he opens the panel and turns one screw a quarter turn, and the whole, lo and behold, the whole assembly line comes back into motion and everybody gets back to work. So of course the manager is very pleased until the engineer, he writes down the bill, the cost, the invoice, £10,000. He hands it over. He looks at him in surprise. £10,000? And obviously what he's implying is all you did was turn the screw a quarter turn. And so the engineer, he turns the invoice over, and on the back of it he writes £1 for turning the screw, £9,999 for knowing which screw to turn. That's the value of knowledge, the knowledge of these small adjustments. And this applies in the spiritual world as well. The verses I recited at the start from Surah إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْض زِلْزَالٍ, the surah about the zalzala of Qiyamah, the massive quake which will break up this earth. It will shake. I've recited the closing and concluding verses of the surah, and some have described them as the most frightening, akhwaf, the most frightening verses of the Quran. You wouldn't immediately assume this when you look at the translation, but you will definitely acknowledge this when you go into the detail. The verses say, فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَهُ. Whoever does the equivalent in weight to a dharra, an atom of goodness, a speck, an iota, yarahu, he will see it. A person who does the slightest good deed will see it on the day of Qiyamah. وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَهُ. And whoever does a good deed equivalent in weight to an atom, to an iota, to a speck, a misdeed, a bad deed, a sin, he will see that too. Shar, khayran shar. Dharra in Arabic, some of the mufassirin mention, is a very tiny ant, just a speck. And so the implied meaning here is a speck, a tiny amount, something which hardly registered, it's something which people don't think about. That slight adjustment can make all the difference. So how is this frightening? It's frightening because nothing is hidden from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's frightening because the balance could tip in any direction. In fact, this is a very strange type of justice as well, because the very system, the very arrangement, if you like, is based on compassion. There is no court on earth in which you can say to the judge that I have only committed this crime in my whole life, and if you put the rest of my life in one pan of the balance and this driving offence on the other, I'm an innocent man, because I have usually driven my car according to the highway code. I should be forgiven this particular mistake of driving dangerously, of speeding, of going through a red light. It's not a valid explanation. It might be taken into consideration, but it won't waive the punishment necessarily. It doesn't work like that in this dunya. So justice is that if you committed a crime, you punish for it. You've broken the law. And there's no greater king than Malikul Mulk, Allah Azza wa Jal, Maliki Yawmiddin. So should he want to, he can punish for every sin. This is why it's mentioned in the hadith, Man nuqisha fil hisabi udhiba. Whoever's hisab and reckoning is scrutinized will be punished. You see, everybody will have something in their skeleton cupboard. Everybody will have a skeleton in their cupboard. There was something that people have done. Every human being will have made a mistake for which he will not have the courage to face the master. And so, should that approach be used, nobody will succeed. But the reality is that this is out of Allah's mercy too, that if your good deeds outweigh your sins, then you are through. You've succeeded. That's the criteria of passing. So there's a huge allowance for making mistakes. But a word of warning here, that's no room for complacency. Let's look at this detail a little bit. Many people, as we learn from the hadith, when they perform salah, it's flung back in their faces like a dirty rag. Some people only get 10% of the reward of their salah, some 20, some 30, all the way up until those who get the full reward. I'm mentioning this example so that we understand a person who is distracted in his salah and is not focusing on Allah, on his salah, he's compared to a thief in the narration. He's stealing the rights of Allah here. He's stealing a glance elsewhere and he's in the court of Allah. And that's why this assumption that, oh, I'll be okay because I've got plenty of good. We don't know if the quality of our good deeds is such that it would pass the level, the threshold of acceptance. We don't know that. Good deeds are not accepted because Allah needs them. They're accepted because of His fadl and favour. That's why after a good deed we conclude with istighfar. After salam in salah itself, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, thrice after the salam, astaghfirullah. So, with reference to the good deeds, are they of the quality that they should be? When an act of charity is performed and then it's disclosed and there's a degree of happiness when someone acknowledges it, then it can be wiped out in an instant. لا تبطلوا صدقاتكم بالمن والأذى. Acts of charity can be wasted when a person brags about them. So there's the charity. The fasting, Is the fasting of the standard it should have been? Fasting is not just holding back from eating and drinking and fulfilling one's desires. Fasting is the avoidance of sins. Have those sins been avoided? So we look at any aspect of our deen. If Allah grants us tawfiq, may Allah make it such that the Haramain, the Sharifain are occupied again as they used to be, with afiyah, and in a similar way, may Allah protect Masjid al-Aqsa and make these places full of inhabitants, people who perform salah there and worship Him with sincerity, and all the masajid. So in Hajj, in which there is so much emphasis, Hajj is about actually remembering Allah. فَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَذِكْرِكُمْ آبَاءَكُمْ أَوْ أَشَدَّ ذِكْرًا. All through zikr. But when a person is in Hajj and they're distracted with material things, then is the Hajj of the standard that should be presented when a person has made such a long journey? So the point is that there can be no complacency when it comes to good deeds. As far as sins are concerned, they've been committed all the time, and for a person who recognizes the greatness of Allah, no sin is too small to be ignored and just committed, considering it to be insignificant. And no good deed is too small to be omitted either. Don't leave a good deed. لا تحتقرن معروفا. Don't leave a good deed because you consider it to be haqir and small. It might be the one that makes the difference, that tips the balance. People who save their pennies as well. When it's important to them to save up for something, they will put pennies and change, loose change, into a money box as well, because eventually it will add up. And on the other hand, if a person thinks to themselves, oh, it's just a small sin, the thought that it's a small sin can make it into a big sin at one level. It can become major because of the audacity of disobedience. And on the other hand, if a person makes a big mistake but they're remorseful, then it can be wiped out. So the whole picture, the severity of the message in these verses are that there are implications. There are implications to what a person does. Allah Azza wa Jal is watching. Alam ya'lam bi anna Allah yara. He's listening. يَعْلَمُ خَائِنَةَ الْأَعْيُنِ وَمَا تُخْفِي الصُّدُورِ. He knows the cheating of the eyes and that which is concealed in the hearts. And وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. Allah says He's closer to a person than the carotid artery. And مَا يَلْفِظُ مِنْ قَوْلٍ إِلَّا لَدَيْهِ رَقِيبٌ عَتِيدٌ. A person utters not a word, but there's a ready recorder nearby taking it down. And so these are the context, these are the circumstances in which we exist. And as for this dunya, the rise and fall of individuals and communities and nations, materially, politically, the changes in the world that happen, the events which happen, the disasters which happen, we live amongst all of this, and yet we are to remember that this is a temporary place. We're not here forever. There's an afterlife, and we need to conduct ourselves here in the best way we possibly can, so that we are ready for that time. So, in conclusion, then, just a point to mention here, the masnoon qira'ah, one of the key themes of the Quran is the akhirah. If you look at the surahs which are sunnah to recite in Fajr, from Surah Hujurat to all the way to all the way up to Surah Al-Buruj, virtually all of them, in one way or another, many in great detail, mention Qiyamah, mention the Akhirah. And then the ones which are mentioned in the same surahs are recited in Dhuhr as well, the Masnoon Qira'ah, according to the Masnoon Qira'ah. If you look at the ones which are recited in Maghrib aloud, there too there's the might of Allah, and many of them talk of the Akhirah. Many of them talk of the Akhirah. And then in Jumu'ah, Suratul A'la, Suratul Ghashiyah talk of the Akhirah. The point here is that in our gatherings as well, we are constantly being reminded of the Akhirah. of what's going to happen after we die, of what's going to happen in the next life. And part of that is what I've just mentioned here. It's about realizing that what we do here will have an impact there. May Allah grant us tawfiq to understand. جو آیتیں میں نے شروع میں تلاوت کی ہیں اذا زلزلت الارض زلزالها، اس صورت کی آخری 2 آیتیں ہیں، ان کو بعض سلف نے، بعض اکابر نے سب سے زیادہ خوفناک آیتوں کے طور پر بیان کیا ہے کہ اگر کوئی کچھ پورے قرآن کا جب تجزیہ کیا جاتا ہے تو بعض آیتیں ایسی ہیں کہ وہ امید سے بری ہوئی ہیں، بعض آیتیں ایسی ہیں کہ ان میں اخلاق سکھائے گئے ہیں، بعض آیتیں ایسی خلاصے کے طور پر، بعض آیتیں ایسی ہیں کہ ان میں خوف کا مضمون ہے. تو ان آیتوں میں خوف کا مضمون ہے کہ انسان کی ایک طرف تو یہ ہے کہ چھوٹی سی چھوٹی نیکی بھی قیامت کے دن سامنے لائی جائے گی، لیکن دوسری طرف یہ ہے کہ چھوٹے سے چھوٹا گناہ بھی اس کے سامنے پیش کیا جائے گا. تو کوئی چیز اللہ تعالیٰ سے چھپی ہوئی نہیں ہے، سب کا سب سامنے لایا جائے گا اور انسان اس کو دیکھے گا، اور پھر مدار اللہ کے فضل پر ہے. اسی لیے علماء فرماتے ہیں کہ کسی نیکی کو حقیر نہ جانو، اس وجہ سے نہ چھوڑو کہ یہ تو معمولی عمل ہے، اور کسی گناہ کو اس لیے کر نہ گزرو کہ یہ تو چھوٹا سا گناہ ہے. اگر کسی چھوٹے سے عمل کو بھی اخلاص کے ساتھ اچھے عمل کو کیا جائے تو کچھ بعید نہیں کہ اللہ تعالیٰ کہ ہاں اس کو بہت بڑا کر دیا جائے، جیسے صدقات میں ہوتا ہے، اور اس اخلاص کی وزن کی وجہ سے وہی عمل انسان کی نجات کا ذریعہ بنے. اور اس کے بالمقابل کوئی گناہ انسان جسارت کے ساتھ اور جرأت مندی کے ساتھ کرتا ہے کہ یہ تو معمولی سی چیز ہے، تو اس سے انسان بہت ممکن ہے کہ بہت دور چلا جائے اس انداز سے. تو در حقیقت غلطی تو ہر انسان سے ہوتی ہے، لیکن گناہوں سے ڈرنا چاہیے اور نیکیوں میں کو امید کا وسیلہ بنانا چاہیے، اللہ تعالیٰ کے قرب اور تقرب کا وسیلہ بنانا چاہیے، اور اس بات کو اپنے دھیان میں رکھنا چاہیے کہ یہ دنیا عارضی جگہ ہے، اس میں وقتی طور پر رہنا ہے، پھر چلے جانا ہے. اور دنیا کے احوال اور حال اور جو اس میں اس کی خوشیاں غمیاں، اس کی رنگ و بو، اس کی دوڑ باغ، اس کی رونقیں، یہ سب عارضی ہیں، یہ مقصود نہیں ہے، اور ان سے انسان کو اپنا دل زیادہ نہیں بہلانا چاہیے. اصل خوشی اور زندگی آخرت کی خوشی ہے. بہرحال دعا کرتے ہیں کہ جو مصیبت زدہ ہیں، جو بیمار ہیں، اللہ تعالیٰ انہیں عافیت دے، صحت دے، جو دنیا سے جا چکے ہیں، مرحومین ہیں، اللہ ان کی مغفرت فرمائے، اور اللہ تعالیٰ اس وبا سے اور اس کے اثرات سے جلدی سے جلدی انسانیت کو نجات عطا فرمائے، اور اس طرح کی مصیبتوں سے آئندہ بھی انسانیت کی اللہ تعالیٰ حفاظت فرمائے. وآخر دعوانا الحمد للہ رب العالمین وصلی اللہ علی النبی الکریم.